Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Vlukovic, and I'm the program director here at Drummond. Joining me today is Bob Ryan, and Bob is Senior Director of Advisory Services, also at Drummond. Bob?
Yeah, yeah, good to be here today. I'm glad we're going to get the chance to talk a little bit about B10, a topic of interest to many of our EHR developers that we work with, as well as providers who will have this feature coming down the path soon. So glad we can talk about it some more today, and I'm hoping also, John, we with your experience from a product management background, and then the work we've been doing on the advisory services side here at Drummond, we'll be able to have a good discussion on this topic with some practical thoughts for our viewers.
Yeah, concur. Yeah, it should be great. So, for the benefit of the audience, we'll run about 30 minutes. And if you have any questions, please share them via the comment section. We have a team that'll keep track of them and forward them to Bob and myself. And we're going to allow about 5 or 10 minutes at the end of this for live Q&A. So, we'll get right to it. So, Bob, it's probably best to level set for our attendees, both the ones that are well-versed and perhaps new to ONC certification, really at a high level. What is the B10 requirement, formerly known and titled Electronic Health Information Export?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way that I like to think about it, and this is the way that the ONC has put it as well, is that it comes from the HIPAA privacy rule. There's always been a requirement there in that rule to be able to provide a patient's health information to them upon request. So what's going on now for electronic health record solutions is that the ONC has really asked them to operationalize that requirement with a function that enables export from these solutions, so that if a patient does walk in the door, not necessarily just a patient, but another provider that might need the records, various scenarios, in addition to some of the legacy capabilities, this will be a specific capability to enable export of a single patient's data or a full patient population export as well. So, I mean, at the highest level, that's what this rule does. It wants EHRs to essentially have a button that they can push that's going to output a full export of everything that's considered to be EHI, electronic health information, or EPHI, as the term is often used in HIPAA. So that's everything except for stuff that's on paper.
Right.
It's the information that's managed by the EHR.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to break that down a little bit more for the audience. And also, too, it's probably important for the team to know that it's one of the conditions of maintenance and certification. In that assurances section, it's very specific and detailed that you have to certify a health IT product which electronically stores EHI to that criteria. So that's, again, where it's coming from. And it's important from a certification standpoint to understand that. So
and that's a good point, John, because last year, a lot of EHRs were looking at G10.
Right.
And that was not everyone was required specifically to have that G10 API capability. But this bulk export is a little bit different because it is, as you said, a condition of certification and maintenance. With G10, it was more of a choice as to whether the EHR wanted to go after the full 100% base EHR set of criteria. And if they wanted to do that, they needed to include the G10 API. And with this B10 requirement as a condition of certification, it pretty much applies to anyone that's certified, any EHR that's certified will need
Excellent
to
point.
meet this bulk export requirement.
Right.
So a little bit different than last year.
Definitely, yeah. Last year being a little bit more technology focused. There is probably looking at this. This is really the largest next technology lift an EHR developer faces this year. But to your point, it was a very specific technology platform for G10, whereas this year you have a little bit more flexibility, yet the breadth of data is a lot larger. So that probably helps us transition into the next sort of focal point around what EHR should be looking at to provide in terms of scope of data and what is really meant by the term computable or acceptable formats. Would you mind getting into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting topic. And I would say with the customers that we've been working with since the first of the year, this has probably been the hairiest area and the one that's been maybe the most misunderstood. Um, I think some developers have come in basically thinking, well, I built a G10 API last year. How about if I just use that? Well, that the scope of data covered by that API was just the US CDI version 1 elements. And that's a significant change. And for all the customers that certified to the Cures updates last year, they know that the full scope of EHI data was expanded from US CDI version 1, but that G10 API was limited still, just in terms of the functionality of that API was limited
Right.
to US CDI version 1. Much bigger scope in terms of what you need to do with this bulk export process. And so the language the rule uses is it says all of the EHI that the health IT produces and electronically manages. Um, and then there's been some other explanation and clarification from the ONC. They've tended to use the term stored in or by the
Correct.
EHR or by the certified health IT. And they've really tried to make clear that it doesn't matter if the data is stored in your certified solution. If it's managed by your solution in some fashion, then it's going to be covered. So that's a high level look at what they're saying, and there are some devils in those details. But one of the good examples that they gave was for archiving,
Yeah.
and the essentially, I mean, if your EHR manages archiving, your whatever your storage for archiving, that may not technically be part of your certified solution, but you're still managing that data from your solution. And that's just kind of one example. I mean, the other, I think, important data point again is the HIPAA privacy rule in terms of looking at scope of data, because anything that the HIPAA privacy rule would allow a patient to request from you is supposed to be covered by this rule. And that's why the ONC has drawn this wide umbrella of scope over the data that needs to be handled through the bulk export process. So I think that may be simple for many EHRs. Maybe it is just everything that is stored in the solution. But for others, they'll need to look a little bit beyond to other things that they're touching. And I don't know if you may have more thoughts, John, about some of the nuances of that. For instance, images um, and other types of data that are involved.
Yeah, sure. But happy to expand. I think data archiving is a good point. Images, and it's all part of really what the certified EHR or module that's part of the certified criteria is manages and stores. So, for instance, that if the module causes information to be stored, then they have ownership of it. So that really has to be part of what they call that designated record set, the EHI. So it does come down to a management perspective. Also, too, is I think one of the nuances, and again, ONC provided some clarification around this, is there's wording around if patient access is allowed in any manner at all. If a patient has a right to that data, then that really is, again, part of what has to be encompassed in that designated record set. So it's pretty wide ranging.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the designated record set, or DRS, because that's a term I think a lot of our customers are already familiar with. It comes
Mm-hmm.
from HIPAA,
Right.
but that is the scope, the same scope that ONC is talking about in the B10 rule for this export. So for compliance people in our audience, if you already understand what DRS really means for your organization and you have that defined, then you can apply that to this bulk export process.
Right, exactly. And
We've
it's
been
probably,
finding, or I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
yeah, go ahead, finish your thought, because then I have a one point to top this off, I think. So go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in the work we've been doing with the HR developers, many of them don't have their arms wrapped as well around this DRS definition specifically for their product. It's been maybe a bit more of a provider facing term because providers need to understand what their DRS is, which can be different from the potential DRS that's defined by all the data that could be stored within an EHR. So anyway, a lot of the work we've been doing actually on B10 has been to help customers look at their DRS and go through a process of defining what it is so that they have covered the things that need to be exported through B10.
Great. And that's a perfect transition to sort of the wrap up point here to say that it's good to hear customers are engaging the Drummond team now, Bob. And I put a plea out there to those that are listening that as you look at, you really have to inventory what you consider your current capabilities. And there's a transition from the legacy B6 data export criteria to the new B10 criteria, and have a hard look now. What you don't want to have is the ACB is available, and your account reps here at Drummond are available to answer some questions. What you don't want to run up against is December of this year, November of this year, doing that inventory and then finding you're up against a timetable to code additional routines to encompass and create that designated record set and make it available for download.
Yeah, when I think about this, it for many customers that are developing these processes, of course they've had some legacy processes in place, and so B10 becomes somewhat of a change management process for them and for their customers.
It does.
And we've encouraged our customers to think about the downstream change management that providers are going to need to do to move into using this B10 capability, which will be pretty comprehensive in terms of the scope of data it covers. But it won't be the same business process necessarily that they've followed in the past, the providers have followed in order to move data to, for patients and other providers and things.
Excellent point. Yeah, excellent point. It was more of a probably medical records driven. You had to have the EHR involved, which you still do technically, and we'll talk about this in more of the patient population export portion of it. But the workflows are going to change a little bit. So that's probably a great point that we can move over to what I'll call topic point 3. So similar to the API world, which again, most of our audience would be familiar with, is there's this requirement in B10 to provide both a singular patient record and full population records. Right, Bob?
Yeah, and that's really important. And I think many people who've read the rule call that out because you have to be able to do this single patient export. The ONC has, while the rule doesn't exactly say this. I mean, the term they've used, they've called this part, the single patient export, the one button export.
Yes.
So in effect, a system user, someone that works within a provider organization, needs to be able to have that function where they can press that button and get a full single patient export out the other end. Patient population export is a bit of a different animal. It can be developer supported. Single patient export cannot be developer supported, but there's a recognition that a full patient population export is more challenging, certainly, particularly in bigger organizations. Another thing, that patient population export, the ONC has clarified that all they're requiring at this point is a full export. So everything that's in EHRA needs to be able to be exported, presumably so it can be moved to another EHR in another organization.
Right.
But what's come up in our customer discussions are a number of use cases that are outside the rule that product organizations may need to still be thinking about. So, for instance, a single doctor moving, that's not necessarily a full population export of everything that's in your EHR. Maybe that doctor can use the single patient function and you can export a bunch of single patient records. If it's a larger group that's moving, that maybe becomes more challenging to use the single patient function. Um, and it kind of actually goes to the documentation requirements in the rule. And in effect, I think these files basically need to be documented. The format needs to be documented so that they're parsable.
Yes.
That's and the reality is, just from a HIPAA privacy perspective, if you have a group or a single physician that's moving into a new practice and needs to transfer records, you can only transfer the records that that doctor or that practice is entitled to see from a privacy and security perspective. But the good news is, I think that if you're creating these documents in the computable or interpretable format that the ONC has specified, you should be able to parse out that full or full population export and get the right records to the group that's moving.
Right. And that's a good point too. Is like there has to have, whether for the single or for the bulk, which again, you make the point as well. And ONC acknowledges this, that full patient export could bring a system to its needs. You'd have response time problems and the like. So you do need health IT developer assistance to perform that. But in any event, whether it's singular or a group export, explanation file has to accompany it, and it actually is part of the hyperlink from Chapel to that documentation to make it usable. And one other point I think that sometimes gets lost in translation is no fees for this. ONC has been very clear about the fact that whether it's singular or the health IT developer needs to get involved to help an organization pull a large amount of records from an EHR into this EHI export format. Again, there's no fees that should be charged for that. So pretty important to remember that as well.
Yeah. And that's definitely an important point. We've had some confusion on that. There was, I think, some expectation that maybe when you're doing this full population export that might be supported by a developer in the organization that you could potentially charge, but the rule says no.
Correct. Right. So maybe we could transition to the all-important topic, information blocking, right? So there are some exceptions that are built into this. As a matter of fact, ONC has a number of FAQs within the information blocking section that specifically speak to this EHI criteria. Could you expand on just some of the exceptions and the way it's approached for information blocking here, Bob?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that, particularly for an EHR's provider customers, that B10 is a technical function that needs to be in the EHR, but it all sits under this umbrella of information blocking, and the providers need to manage the full process from the point when they receive a request from someone who's entitled to receive this export to the point where that request reaches the person who can push the button in the system. Then with B10, the system's going to pump out that export once the capability is implemented. But then after that, there's also a need to have processes to deliver that exported file or files to the requester.
Right.
So all of that sits under the mantle of information blocking. In other words, that full process, of which B10 is just the middle part, needs to be part of EHR's thinking in terms of what functionality they want to extend to their customers. Do they want to just focus on the specific things that B10 requires? Press a button, get a file. or will they be looking at other functionality to manage requests, to manage delivery of that file to the requester, other processes that they probably have in place in some form today for legacy processes. So particularly that delivery of the file, I think, then you're looking at potentially password and encryption controls, maybe. There are identity verification issues with respect to who the requester is, and then ultimately if you're delivering it to that verified person. All those types of things that exist in other ways with providers and EHRs today will need to be transitioned and built around this B10 capability.
Yeah, that's a really good point from the security side, which again, you have a background in, Bob, to understand that, think about your attack surface has widened a little bit with this requirement, because now this is just an extra point of provisioning data that, again, as you
Right.
had said, authentication and access is key, where it was more for the B6 legacy criteria, it was more centered on the EHR technology provider was assisting with that, and the files were typically kept local, for instance. There's a lot more outward facing attack surface here with this criteria. So good point to bring that in.
Yeah, I think it's great to think of this from an attack surface perspective, because that's the way the providers have to look at it. They're
Right.
still subject to all of the privacy requirements that exist around this data. And they're going to have to deal with that, even if an EHR were taking a fairly narrow view of what's required by B10.
Right.
And you do you have any other comments about sort of how this has operated in the world prior to B10? Because I know that these types of data transfers have been happening, and the requests are out there.
Right. So yeah, again, just drawing on from the EHR perspective, it tended to be obviously it's a combination of there's view, download, and transmit. The patient has access there and continues to do that forward, and then this type of information typically was provided on a case-by-case basis through medical records. Sometimes the provider was packing up their practice and using the traditional legacy data export functionality, and that was. The word summary was in there. The word summary is even in the view, download, transmit functionality. So it was more of whatever I could wedge into a CCDA file, and that should be the amount of data that was either exported or transferred over. You were sectioned into a summary and a specific format. We now know that the EHI, export functionality as a designated record set, the breadth of data is larger, and the requirements and formats are a little bit more open-ended. You can use for a majority of the data, perhaps some of the standards that are available today in time. But there may be some data points within the data that's controlled by the EHR, certified technology, that may be outside the purview of a specific standard. So you have to, from a developer perspective, make some enhancements and to both the access, whether it's medical records, whether it's from providers, and again, from EHR developer routines that are most likely there now, how you're going to encompass all of that data, put it into a computable format, provide README and instruction without a charge to ensure that data is able to be ported onto the next location. So this is again, we have said, and we've coined over here, this is probably the largest technology lift that an EHR developer might have this year.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good time actually also to mention, I see we had a question on it. One of the reasons we teed up this LinkedIn Live was because we're hitting the 6-month mark for EHRs to comply with this. For Drummond certified customers, the deadline is December 1st. So 6 months from today, the attestation is due. Live testing is not required for this function. Whenever we talk about attestation, I think it's important to say that self-testing is really what attestation means.
Good point.
So you need to be able to confirm within your organization that you've met all the requirements make that attestation with the right person signing on the dotted line by December 1st of this year. And then Drummond will be processing those attestations in order to enable its customers to meet the 12/31 deadline, which is to have this up on the chapel and the functionality fully available to your end customers by that 12/31 date.
Yeah, really good point there. And then by attesting that it is available, that would be, again, your point. You've self-tested. You've made it available is the key word here, is your customers of your EHR, providers, administrative folks, medical records, that functionality is there and is available for use. So the clock is ticking. And again, I think to reiterate our point earlier, the breadth of data is a lot more than most EHRs have had to provide up to this particular point. So as some have already engaged your team and the ACB, start now. Make sure you're ready to go and you're not come screaming in December 1.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I know we had another question about who this applies to, and we just briefly touched on that at the very beginning today, but it basically applies to anyone who's certified. Now, it's a condition of certification in order to have this export function.
Right. Exactly. And in conditions of certification have written into them, just to answer another question, specifics about whether fees or not can be charged. And if it's a certification criteria that you have to provide, that's where the nuance is, that this is technology that for that single push button download for a patient, or en masse or subset of a large portion of that data that the EHR developer might have to open up a routine or provide access to. That has to come as part of your standard product. Let's see, any other questions? Briefly, probably just as a reminder, Bob, do you want to just sum up the information that's available for those folks that just might visit the Drummond webpage, things that are available for our Drummond customers, and some touch points on ONC?
Yes, absolutely. So one resource that people can look to, we published a blog back in March called Moving from G10 to B10. And that's available on the Drummond site under our resources section, where you can access all of our blog posts. That's a good blog to look at. Our advisory team is also available. We'd be happy to get on a call and talk to you about the types of things that we're working with customers on to jumpstart their efforts to get organized around their B10 project. And then there's a few ONC resources that are helpful too. I typically, if I just get on Google and search for ONC B10, it pulls most of them up, takes you to the healthit.gov site. They have a good fact sheet out there. They have a companion guide page.
Right.
And there are also FAQs on information blocking and EHI that are useful to look at there. So I'd recommend all those. And anything else that comes to mind for you, John?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think our Drummond customers have the advantage of a knowledge-based article too that specifically addresses B10 requirements. So again, if you're a Drummond customer, make sure you get on the portal and check that out. And one last important question there is live testing, again, required with a test lab. That is not a requirement. This is a testation, but to Bob's point, do some self-testing such that if there was any audits that had to occur, you'd be able to prove that your functionality is in fact working. So with that, we have actually reached the end of the session. Do want to extend our appreciation to those folks that took a time out and shared this can share this information forward. This will be recorded and available on the Drummond website in the next couple of days, and we encourage you to visit drummond.com for information and guidance. And we look forward to engaging folks as we go along. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everybody who joined.